Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, let's check in here with Bitcoin dominance, see what's going on. If you're new to the channel, we've essentially been following this multi-year thesis that dominance would go into an uptrend and potentially top out by the end of the halving year, or potentially as late as early as 2025. Now, it already went to the 60% milestone, which was my target, right? That was my target for this cycle, was to go to around that 60% level. And one of the reasons that was the target was just sort of assuming that dominance retraces back to where the bubble of altcoins against Bitcoin began in March of 2021. Also, we said that it would likely retrace to the 618 fib because that's where it went last cycle, the 618. So perhaps that's exactly what it's going to do this cycle, right? Always a chance. The one thing, though, that I think it makes sense to at least be open-minded to, right? I'm not asking you to take it to the bank, okay? They're not going to cash it in. It's not an investing thesis at this point. But the one thing I would say is this. In 2020, we had a very similar thing happen where dominance went up in, sort of September, October. You see that? Same thing over here, right? Going up September, October. And then in November, dominance got a pretty big drop, making everyone think that dominance was going to drop a lot more. In fact, look at this. Look at that. You see these tags, this trend line? Dominance kept tagging it, and it kept getting rejected. So it made sense back then to think that, maybe it was just going to continue to go down. And what ended up happening was dominance took everyone by surprise. Maybe not everyone. Because, if you're a Bitcoin maxer, you just always assume dominance is going to go up. But it swept the high. You see that? You see how dominance then swept the high? Now, here's the thing. Every time Bitcoin dominance did that last cycle, it did eventually sweep the high before pulling back. The first time it did that, though, it actually continued to go up again. The second time it did it, it just went down. For a long time, I've assumed, and maybe wrongfully so, right, but I assumed that you would get this top first and then this top later on, right? Or sorry, I assumed you would get this top first and then this top later on. The reason this top occurred, arguably, is because that is when QE began, right? If you overlay Bitcoin dominance and you say take that top, you'll see that QE began, and that's where Bitcoin dominance topped. But what you'll also notice is that dominance went up again and then found a second top, slightly higher high, in December or early January. It was early January of 2021. So what if, and again, I'm not asking you to take it to the bank, but what if these two tops from last cycle are being combined this cycle into a single top, right? Where you see Bitcoin dominance top whenever QE returns, but you also see it potentially top, potentially, in the early part of the post-halving year. Remember, last cycle, the high for dominance, forget the narratives, forget QE and QT, forget interest rate cuts, forget all of it. Throw it out the window. No one cares. The chart tells the story. When did dominance top? When did it actually top? Did it top in September 2019 when QE began? Sort of. It put in a high, but it wasn't the high. The high occurred the last week of December going into January of 2021. More specifically, dominance topped January 3rd of 2021. So last cycle, dominance topped in the post-halving year, right? In the post-halving year. What if it does the same thing this cycle, right? What if, and I could be wrong, right? I'm not asking you to take it to the bank again, but what if this drop right here by dominance in November of 2020 is the same drop that we just got in November of 2024, right? Where it gets that drop and it seems like dominance is going to go down, but then it just turns around when everyone least expects it and then goes back up, right? Is that what it's doing? Is that what it's doing? It could be, right? It certainly could be. If you look here at dominance on, so let's look at a regular scale, right? If you look at dominance, what you'll notice is that, you could argue that it's just sort of finding support at a higher low, right? It's just sort of finding support. I would defer to Bitcoin dominance excluding stable coins, right? Bitcoin dominance excluding stables. Now, if you look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stables, if I could find it, one of the things you'll notice is that we talked about this a lot, that it would likely go up to 65% and then crash. 65% and hit the top of the wedge. We followed this wedge for years. And you can see that it did, right? But is it getting back into the wedge, right? That's the question, right? Is it working its way back in? It depends on how you draw, right? I mean, if you draw down here and connect all these points, you can see it kind of already is back up there. If you look at the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA, it hasn't really broken through yet. So it's possible it's just setting up to get rejected and go down in 2025. But I just want people to remember that even when the market seems like what's going to happen, right? It seems obvious when things are going to play out. Just remember, like late 2020 and early 2021 taught us, dominance can go up even if you think it can't. And one of the reasons why it should be at least on your radar is because, if you look at, we've talked about the dollar a lot and how the dollar would likely rally going into the end of the year. We've been on top of this like crazy. I said when the Fed cuts rates, the dollar will rally into the end of the year, and now it's what it's doing. I expect the dollar to top out early January. If the dollar tops out early January, that probably means Bitcoin dominance tops out early January. And also, I think the reason you're seeing this correction in the markets is because the 10-year yield is going up. When the long end of the yield curve goes up, you generally get a correction, right? You can see over here when the 10-year yield broke out in July 2023, we also had a correction, right? If you overlay the S&P 500 onto this chart, you'll see that the S&P got this correction as the 10-year yield bottomed out right there. Now the 10-year yield sort of bottomed out again at the 21-week EMA after breaking out, and you can see the S&P is also getting a correction again. This correction over here started at around 4,600. This correction by the S&P right now is starting at around 6,100. So it's a much higher level, but you're seeing the same process play out. So when I think about, and by the way, I mean, one of the reasons too that people might be spooked is just you're seeing the yield curve on invert, right? The yield curve on inversion is something that you shouldn't just ignore. I know a lot of people sort of scoff at it, but remember, it's when the yield curve uninverts that markets can sometimes get spooked. So, and the uninversion process is taking place. So what I would say is, as far as Bitcoin dominance goes, is that if it's going to go higher, it's probably going to do so in the next few weeks, right? If it's going to. Now, again, it can go higher one of two ways. It can go higher on a Bitcoin rally. It can go higher on a Bitcoin dump. The reason why it could go higher no matter what is because QE still hasn't started. If QE had already started, I would argue that Bitcoin dominance would go down no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. But because QE hasn't started yet, you could argue that Bitcoin dominance will go up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. Especially considering from a cyclical point of view, dominance didn't top last cycle until early January 2021. The first top was September 2019 when QE began. What if the Fed begins QE in January and dominance tops the same time that it did last cycle in January of 2025? But instead of getting a nice double top, you just get some type of single top that marks the top of Bitcoin dominance. That's a possibility, right? One of the reasons why it's still possible for dominance to go higher is we know that ETH Bitcoin historically doesn't really turn around until, January. sometimes late December, but doesn't really start going up again until January, right? This was January of 2015, or sorry, January 2016. This was January 2017. This was January 2018, January of 2019, January of 2020, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a good reason to believe that ETH Bitcoin might not find that sustained strength until January of the post-halving year. Furthermore, if you were to look at alt Bitcoin pairs, and I don't know exactly how to feel about this because dominance did in fact already go to 60%. So I'm not as married to this idea. But if you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you'll notice that they also did get rejected from this level in 2017 and in 2019. And maybe they're just getting rejected here once again. The good news is for alt Bitcoin pair holders is maybe they'll find support at the bull market support band. But there's also a chance that this is just sort of an expanding, broadening, or it's a broadening wedge where we just keep chasing one narrative to the other, right? Where it's like, oh, it's Bitcoin season, no altcoin season, no Bitcoin, no altcoin, no Bitcoin season, no altcoin season, right? And it just keeps kind of going back and forth. And the reason it doesn't break out is because you keep not getting QE. And the reason it doesn't break down is because you still don't have a recession, right? And so it just keeps going from one extreme to the other. The other thing is that others Bitcoin has also, had a fairly nice move up recently, and I'm watching to see if it can hold support at the bull market support band. The only thing to consider beyond that, though, is that last cycle we did see others Bitcoin drop 60, rally 60, and then drop 60 again. Same thing's potentially happening again, where it drops 60, rallies 60, and then maybe drops 60 again. So far, it only dropped about 46 or so. Remember, last cycle when others Bitcoin did get that 60% rally, it corresponded to the Fed pause, which is exactly when it rallied this cycle with the Fed pause. Others Bitcoin then bottomed out at around 0.06 or so. Okay, so I don't think it's going to go that low, but it's possible it could go lower than that. I just wonder about, I really struggle with the whole alt Bitcoin stuff because historically I've always thought that alts are oscillators against Bitcoin at best, meaning that they sort of top out around parity with Bitcoin, right? When the market cap of alts is roughly equivalent to the market cap of Bitcoin, that's where alts top out against Bitcoin. And then they bottom out at about a quarter of Bitcoin's market cap. And so far, they only went to 0.34. Now, technically, if you include more stable coins into this, you could argue they went below 0.34, right? If you include USDC, you could argue that they already went down to 0.032, and the bottom would still be 0.25. So you could argue that they don't even need to drop as much to see that same move. But just remember that you do occasionally get these big rallies by all Bitcoin pairs, only to then see them give those gains right back. And actually, a really similar thing happened in 2020. I mean, look at this move, right? I mean, total 3, all Bitcoin pairs were dropping. They rallied in November. They got one final sell-off in December. They bottomed out, and then they went up in 2021. You might see something very similar happen again, right? Where they drop into the end of the year, early January, and then all Bitcoin pairs go up in 2025. You could also look at total 3 just divided by Bitcoin and see, very similar types of moves, right? Where it kind of had the similar rallies in the past, where it rallied up to around this level. Here it had a wick even higher, still went to the range lows, right? Even though it felt like it never would, it still ultimately went to the range lows. So, I mean, look, as I said a few months ago, I think some level of diversification is good, but at all times, Bitcoin, you could still argue that Bitcoin could outperform the altcoin market until QE returns. Furthermore, again, as the dollar goes up, as I've said, right, it's going to be a drag on risk assets, especially with the long of the yield curve going up. It's going to be a drag. And, with Bitcoin going down, it's sort of the most painful option because, like, Bitcoin is only down 2%, and altcoins have essentially been falling off a cliff, right? I mean, they're down, a lot of them are down, 5, 10% across the board. So there's certainly a lot going on in the market right now. And Bitcoin dominance is frankly all over the place. It went below 57 a few minutes ago. Earlier today, it was almost 59. So it's a bit all over the place. So try to be somewhat patient with watching it ultimately play out. But I do wonder, about some of these alts, and maybe you're going to see the setup of double bottoms of alt Bitcoin pairs. Maybe they just bottom when QE returns, and perhaps if this sell-off continues, then just sort of express it again. What if the dominance peak ends up being a single peak, right? Somewhere over here, where you're combining the end of QT and the seasonality into one, right? Where you end QT somewhere over here, and then also you have that seasonality going into the post-halving year where normally Bitcoin dominance goes down. I wonder if that is the most likely outcome. But again, the only way you're going to get QE is if the markets really start to struggle, right? So I guess if there's a chance, right, if there's a chance that the markets do continue to struggle, maybe that's how you get QE next month. Maybe that's how it happens. One of the things I would remind people about alts is that they did the same thing in 2016, right? And in 2020. In fact, they struggled in December of 2020. I know it doesn't sound like it, doesn't seem like it, but they did. They really did struggle. Even in December of 2020, a lot of them did. And in 2016, we've talked about this before, right? With ETH, right? In 2016, it had three capitulations: April, August, and December. And so I guess the argument is, what if it does the same thing, right? What if you have your April drop, you have your August drop. What if you get one final drop in December that marks the bottom of ETH USD before going up or no, I mean, it doesn't have to be a new low, but it could just mark a local low for ETH USD in sort of in the next like couple of weeks or so, next few weeks, and then it goes up in 2025, and that also could very well mark the bottom for ETH Bitcoin, or a double bottom for ETH Bitcoin. If you were to go look at quarterly returns, or not quarterly returns, I want to look at year-to-date returns. If you go look at year-to-date returns for Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, you can see it's shooting back up. It also did the same thing in 2020, right? You see this move? You see where it drops and then it kind of shoots back up into the end of the year? It seems like it's doing something really similar, does it not? 2016, you can kind of see it as well, right? But it went up around this time. And then you can see it continued to stay strong until the end of the year. And then early 2017, if you look at 2017, you can see the dominance eventually fell off a cliff. If you look at 2021, dominance eventually fell off a cliff. So you're probably going to see dominance drop a lot in 2025, but that doesn't mean it can't go up before then. As far as how high, there's still a chance the top is already in for dominance. But if all Bitcoin pairs do have to actually go to the range lows, then it's always possible dominance goes higher, right? I mean, if you look at sort of a fib retracement, if it's not the 618, then the next spot you look, I guess, is the 786, and that would be mid 60s or so, mid 60s. Obviously things would have to get quite bad for something like that to happen, but it is at least a consideration to make. But that's essentially where I stand on dominance. And listen, I'm not going to go on for hours and hours and hours and hours. You guys get the idea. If you want to hear more about Bitcoin dominance, we have about probably 50 videos on it. Many of them are over an hour long. So go watch those, learn the lessons so that in 2026 you don't become victim to the same thing. But dominance is an important way to navigate the cryptoverse. It helps you know when to stay Bitcoin heavy, when to stay altcoin heavy. It also is sort of an admission of who knows what's going to happen with the markets, but I want to make sure I maximize my risk-adjusted returns. And normally Bitcoin outperforms altcoin market collectively until the post-halving year. Post-halving year is still a few weeks away. So it all depends on how, does dominance, does it sort of go into its final top or a lower high on a drop or a rally? That's always the question to ask. Sometimes it's a drop, sometimes it's a rally. So far, it appears to be a drop. But even then, right? Even then, if you say it appears to be a drop, I mean, is it, right? I mean, it's Bitcoin's basically the same price it was last week. I mean, last week, Bitcoin had hit 94K, I mean, it's just something to consider. I mean, at some point, it's possible that Bitcoin could maybe backtest this, right? That would be, if something that would happen, obviously that would probably send ETH home. But I don't know. I don't know if you're going to see that. And when the QQQ launched, it took until it took until a full year after the ETF launched to see that correction, which would still be a little bit of time away. But why don't we go ahead and wrap it up there? Those are my views on Bitcoin dominance. I'm certainly not as strongly convinced that it has to go higher, but I would say to expect that it could go higher at least for a couple more weeks. Last cycle, it didn't even top until early January of the post-halving year. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.